Dr. Eric Walsh once made an interesting statement which went something like this: "If the devil can't use failure against you, he'll try to use success against you." Pride is most often regarded as thinking more highly of yourself than you ought, which is shown by acting in a vain and condescending way with an air of exclusivity. Though this is a common expression of it, an equally if not more common expression of pride is to pity oneself into thinking that the world is out to get them, known as depression. Things like, "I can't speak to that person, they'll only think ill of me," or "if only they knew how difficult my life is, then they would understand why I must stay home," are frequent in the mind of the depressed. Our enemy simply wants us to focus as much of our time, thoughts, and energy on ourselves as he can convince us to, so that what's left won't do much good to anybody. This method of distraction works very well, number one and most obviously because we're finite creatures with limited time. The more of it he can waste, the better. The second reason is because the label of depression validates how we feel and is a mindset that is very easy to settle into. How often do we hear that people remain sad so long as they continue to dwell on their less than adequate situation? It's only after we roll out of bed, get dressed, and put our shoes on that we see our problems are truly insignificant when compared to the overflowing goodness of the world as a whole. But before we get out of bed, we must decide that there is something beyond us, something that's at the very least equally worth our time as we think ourselves to be. On the one hand, thinking exclusively good of ourselves forms a type of bubble world around us where everyone would like to pay just to kiss our toes. This bubble is extremely enjoyable, and the fish inside is very unlikely to pursue truth at the risk of having it popped. On the other hand, considering oneself a downtrodden, weary traveler in a world full of spiteful acquaintances gives us just as much reason to think of ourselves every second of every day. We like very much to have good reasons to feel bad so that we are not in a good enough mental state to help our neighbor or do the basic Christianly things, let alone the ones God may have planned for our short lives. In fact, the second type of pride is most often the preferred type because even a traditionally proud person, like the Pharisees for example, could still make positive change in the world for the sake of feeling better about themselves. However, someone who is in the fetal position, so to speak, feeling under attack on every side, is very unlikely, even with selfish intent, to consider, let alone act on another person's needs. And that is exactly the kind of society that spreads this prideful depression because, as we think less of others, others must naturally think more of themselves, and this fantasy of being alone in the world will eventually become reality. As we can clearly see, pride is running rampant these days. It's more and more popular to go to therapy and take time for self-love. And to be clear, therapy and self-love, when applied correctly, are both very good and useful things. But it's this hyper-selfish society that's made them a pastime where charity and brotherly love once were. There is a genuine type of depression and a fool's depression. The latter is what we're talking about. It's something each of us considers picking up and putting on, so that we can live as special needs citizens without being treated like we are low performers, even though that's exactly what we become. This is the delusion of the 21st century. And what a good delusion it is, because as we seek to fulfill ourselves with these empty things, we just fall deeper into our trouble. This is because we were never intended to fulfill ourselves. We were created to be fulfilled by God. And if that doesn't work because we don't believe in Him, or He simply doesn't suit our idea of fullness, then we look to other humans, then sex, drugs, and alcohol, and finally ourselves until we are all out of options and realize that nothing is going to work. At this stage, many like to come up with a less unsettling reason for being unfulfilled, like depression, than the truth that they themselves aren't enough. It's much easier to blame circumstance or one's parents than to point the finger at the real perpetrator and say, yes, I have made myself into someone disagreeable and refuse to take the help of my Maker, so I will continue to be disagreeable. That, you can clearly see, is not something we want to hear. Admitting that we're not enough, even for ourselves, brings us to the lowest of lows, especially after being conditioned by society as we have. You've noticed the advertisements, haven't you? The ones that say we deserve it, as if we've worked very hard and earned ourselves another useless something. Consider when you get an unexpected sum of money. What is it that we think of doing with it first? Hopping on Amazon and seeing what they have to offer in order to make our life more comfortable is the common inclination. As if our fellow believers in Pakistan making bricks 16 hours a day couldn't put the money to better use. The fact of it is that, on our own, we are worse than unimportant. We're lowly, wormish, conniving little creatures that ought to get something a little worse than death. This is in part perhaps one of the reasons why Satan fell in the first place. We are told he, from God's perspective, which encompasses all things and who is not easily impressed, was perfect in beauty and full of wisdom. Can you see then why the devil might think it foolish, unjust even, to give us naked creatures a planet to manage? Of course, there were many dysfunctional aspects of their relationship before that, but this one thing may be the factor that tipped the scales for him. And so this delusion of self-importance and pity continues. We forget about our neighbor, let alone playing this game called Christianity. To keep from being involved in the game and still calling yourself a player is just as good as not owning a horse, but still considering yourself an equestrian. You most simply and obviously aren't. Similarly, those who fall into this trap may call themselves Christians, but in refusing to take any action for anyone but themselves, prove to everyone just how little they really want to live like Christ. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the evildoers doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Don't even the non-believers do that? Thank goodness God is much more gracious than you or I, and some may have legitimate reasons to pity themselves, which He will no doubt be patient enough to help them work through. In these cases, taking a time out in order to become a better player in the long run is something that is easily accepted by our Heavenly Father. He does indeed see into our hearts and does not wish that any should perish. Even still, such cases are only valid if these people are actually accepting help and correction, keeping the goal of betterment in mind. One cannot pretend to be changing when they spend more time coming up with excuses for their shortcomings than working on breaking bad habits. This too is something that our Maker is very aware of. I choose to leave it up to Him to determine those of us who have the right to self-pity and those of us who do not. I don't feel that many of us have, considering the great suffering He sent His own Son through, but I could very well be wrong. So what now? How might a person experiencing this type of thing seek to be rid of it? The first thing might be to, while we're still laying sadly in bed, realize that everything good is from God's hand. You yourself were made by Him, the home you're in was given to you, the people in your life He has placed there. It's true we work at these things, but they're only available to work at because of events that are out of our control. After all, wasn't it God who placed life and character into the embryo that is now called you? Secondly, it would help to take a detailed look at the sufferings of Christ. Sometimes we hear them described in such Christian terms that they really don't carry proper weight, like death by torture and disfigured beyond recognition, which is exactly what they were. Christ accomplished the love, servitude, and compassion demanded by God up until the wretched end. In seeing this, we realize that God is not in the least bit interested in our silly excuses as to why we cannot follow Christ's example, nor will they keep us from the punishment pride demands. Finally, act like you care. This is when, despite our feelings, we ought to hop out of bed and get involved in fixing someone else's problems. This alone is a powerful act of faith in the promise that God will restore our joy. But helping others brings healing into our hearts because as we mimic Christ, we innately draw near to Him in spirit, and we know that in His presence there is joy forevermore. As Jesus said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Not only that, but we were told that if we give, it will be given to us. Our acts of kindness and servitude are more than just good things. They're investments which will pay off in due time. In this way, depression gets pushed to the back of our minds where God scoops up the dusty pieces and throws them away. Despite us being unaware of Him doing this, soon we are feeling as if we truly were doing all right. Our focus has shifted from our very real and persistent problems to the even more persistent grace of God and strength He provides when we are weak. We cherish this thing called Christianity more than ever because now we see just how much we need saving. We look on ourselves not with pride or disgust, but with bulging hope for who Christ will mold us into as we continue to submit to His will. Examine your heart and consider, could this cure your depression?